The Wildflower appeared on her doorstep the morning after she told the entire saloon she did not need a man, and Josephine Miller had no idea who kept placing them there. But after 3 weeks of finding a different bloom each dawn, she was determined to catch the mysterious admirer and tell him to stop wasting his time. The summer of 1876 had settled over Prescott, Arizona territory, with the weight of a wool blanket, and Josephine woke each morning before the sun crested the mountains to help her father run the general store they had opened 2 years prior. Her mother had died during the journey west from Missouri, a fever that took her quickly, and left Josephine and her father Thomas to build a life from the ashes of their grief. She was 22 years old now, practical-minded and sharp-tongued. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely back and green eyes that could assess the worth of a man faster than he could tip his hat. The wildflowers bothered her because they represented something she had convinced herself she did not want. After watching her father crumble when her mother died, after seeing the way loss could hollow out a person until they were nothing but a shell going through motions, Josephine had decided that needing someone was the greatest weakness a person could have. She was fine alone. She had told herself this so many times it had become a prayer, a mantra, a wall she had built brick by brick around whatever soft parts of herself remained. But the wildflowers kept coming. This morning it was a cluster of desert marigolds, their yellow petals bright as butter in the dim pre-dawn light. Josephine picked them up, felt their delicate stems between her fingers, and looked out across the dusty main street of Prescott. A few early risers were already moving about, the blacksmith stoking his forge, old Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch. No one suspicious, no one watching her with particular interest. "Another one?" her father asked when she came inside, the flowers still in her hand. "I am going to find out who is doing this and tell him he is wasting perfectly good wildflowers on someone who has no intention of marrying," Josephine said firmly, though she placed the marigolds in a tin cup of water on the windowsill beside all the others that had not yet wilted. Thomas Miller looked at his daughter with sad, knowing eyes. "Your mother would not have wanted you to spend your life alone because you are afraid of losing someone." "I am not afraid," Josephine said, perhaps too quickly. "I am practical. This territory is hard enough without making yourself vulnerable to that kind of pain." Her father did not argue, but she saw the disagreement in his face as he turned to unlock the front door of the store. The early morning customers would be arriving soon, ranch hands needing supplies before heading out to their claims, women buying flour and sugar and fabric for dresses that would be worn thin within a year in this unforgiving climate. Prescott sat in a high valley surrounded by granite peaks and pine forests, cooler than the deserts to the south, but still plenty hot when summer arrived in full force. It had become the territorial capital just 2 years earlier, and the town was growing fast. Buildings going up along streets that had been nothing but dirt paths when Josephine first arrived. There was optimism here, a sense that people could build something lasting if they worked hard enough, but there was also danger. Apache raids were still common in the surrounding areas. Outlaws passed through regularly, and the law was often nothing more than whatever the men with guns decided it would be. Josephine had learned to navigate this world by making herself indispensable and untouchable. She kept the books for the store with meticulous precision. She knew every item in their inventory and could calculate prices faster than most men could count. And she had made it clear to every cowboy and prospector who came through that she had no interest in romance. She was polite but distant, helpful but never encouraging, and after 2 years most of the men in Prescott had learned to admire her from afar or not at all. Except someone had not gotten the message. The day passed in its usual rhythm of customers and restocking and keeping the accounts balanced. Josephine measured out flour and sugar, cut lengths of fabric, sold ammunition and tobacco, and the hard candy that children would press their noses against the glass case to see. She was good at this work, good at the small interactions that required courtesy but not intimacy. And by the time evening came, she was tired in a way that felt earned and clean. That night, she lay in bed in the small room above the store and made a plan. Tomorrow she would wake even earlier than usual and watch from her window. She would catch whoever was leaving the flowers, and she would end this peculiar courtship before it went any further. It was the practical thing to do, the sensible thing, and Josephine had built her life on being practical and sensible. But sleep did not come easily, and she found herself thinking about the wildflowers despite her best efforts not to. Whoever was leaving them knew the desert plants, knew which ones were blooming in the different washes and hillsides around Prescott. The variety had been impressive: brittlebush and lupine, penstemon and Indian paintbrush, globe mallow and desert chicory. Each one was fresh picked, often still damp with morning dew, and each one had clearly been chosen with care. It was the care that unsettled her most. She woke well before dawn, when the sky was still black and star-scattered, and positioned herself by the window where she could see her doorstep without being seen. The street was empty and silent except for a dog nosing through garbage behind the saloon. Josephine waited, her body tense with anticipation, watching the darkness slowly fade to gray. That was when she saw him. He moved like a shadow, quiet and careful, leading his horse rather than riding it so the hoofbeats would not wake anyone. Even in the dim light she could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothes of a working cowboy. Worn denim trousers, a faded shirt, a hat pulled low. He stopped at her doorstep and crouched down, and she saw him place something there with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his size. Then he was back on his horse and moving away, heading toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open territory. Josephine did not think, she just moved. She threw a shawl over her nightgown, shoved her feet into boots, and hurried down the stairs and out into the street. The wildflower on her doorstep was a single stalk of scarlet gilia, impossibly red even in the pre-dawn gloom. She left it there and began walking in the direction the cowboy had gone. She found him at the livery stable at the edge of town, tending to his horse in one of the corrals. He had not yet noticed her approach, and in the growing light she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she had expected, probably not much older than herself, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was sun-weathered but handsome in a rough-hewn way. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, an economy of motion that spoke of someone who had spent most of his life working with animals and the land. "Why are you leaving flowers on my doorstep?" Josephine called out, her voice sharper than she intended. The cowboy startled, spinning around to face her. His eyes were brown, she noticed, warm and deep like good earth, and for a moment he looked utterly panicked to have been caught. Then his expression shifted to something more guarded, defensive. "Did not mean to disturb you, miss," he said quietly. "You have been disturbing me every morning for 3 weeks," Josephine said, walking closer. "I want to know why." He was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck. The animal was a paint mare, well cared for despite her rough appearance. Finally, he said, "I heard you that night in the saloon, when you said you did not need anyone." Josephine remembered that night. She had been bringing her father his dinner, and a drunk ranch hand had made some crude comment about her needing a husband. She had responded loudly enough for half the saloon to hear that she was perfectly fine alone and had no intention of becoming some man's property. "And you decided to prove me wrong?" she asked, her tone icy. "No," the cowboy said, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "I decided you were right. I am fine alone too, have been for years. But then I thought about how even if we are fine alone, that does not mean the world has to be empty of beautiful things. So I have been leaving you wildflowers, not because I expect anything from you. Just because I thought you might like them." The answer caught her off guard, knocked the wind out of her prepared arguments. She had expected him to be another persistent suitor, another man who thought he could wear down her resistance with enough attention. But this was something different, something she did not quite know how to categorize. "That is ridiculous," she said, but there was less conviction in it now. "Probably," he agreed. He turned back to his horse, began brushing her coat with long, steady strokes. "I will stop if you want. I just thought it might be nice to wake up to something pretty. The desert has enough harsh in it without adding more." Josephine stood there in her nightgown and shawl and boots, the morning sun beginning to paint the mountains gold, and she did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to tell him yes, stop, leave her alone. But another part, a part she had been trying to silence for 2 years, was whispering that maybe it was nice to wake up to something pretty. Maybe it was nice to be thought of, even by a stranger. "What is your name?" she asked finally. "Caleb," he said, not turning around. "Caleb Stone, Josephine Miller. Though you probably already knew that." "Yes, miss." "And you are not leaving the flowers because you want something from me. You are not expecting courtship or marriage or anything else." Now he did turn, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "I told you, I am fine alone. I have a homestead claim about 5 miles north of here, been working it for 3 years. It is hard work and it is lonely work, and at the end of most days, I am too tired to think about much beyond eating and sleeping. But I ride into town once a week for supplies, and I have seen you at your father's store, and I noticed that you never smile. Thought maybe the wildflowers might change that." "I smile," Josephine said defensively. "Not really," Caleb said, but there was no judgment in it, just observation. "You are polite and you are efficient and you are good at your job, but I have never seen you look happy. Made me sad, I suppose. So I started leaving flowers." The honesty of it was almost painful. Josephine wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, suddenly aware that she was standing in the street in her nightgown having a conversation that was far too personal with a man she had never spoken to before. "I should go back," she said. "My father will be waking soon and we have to open the store." "All right," Caleb said. "I will stop with the flowers if you want." Josephine opened her mouth to say yes, stop, it is too much. But what came out was, "No, you can keep leaving them. If it makes you feel less lonely to pick them, then I suppose it does no harm." She saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure. He nodded once, a small dip of his head. "Thank you, Miss Miller." She turned and walked back toward the store, her heart beating faster than it should have been from such a simple exchange. Behind her, she heard Caleb speaking softly to his horse, the sound of tack being adjusted, the creak of leather as he mounted. She did not turn around to watch him ride away, but she felt his departure like a shift in the air. The scarlet Gilia was still on her doorstep when she returned, even more vivid now in the full morning light. Josephine picked it up and brought it inside, adding it to the collection on the windowsill. There were so many now, some fresh and some wilting, a riot of color against the plain wooden frame. Her father looked at them when he came downstairs, looked at her, but said nothing. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Each morning Josephine found a wildflower on her doorstep, and each morning she added it to the collection. She did not wake early to watch Caleb again, but she thought about him more than she wanted to admit. She thought about his quiet voice, his careful hands on the horse, the way he had said he was fine alone with the kind of certainty that came from practice, from convincing yourself of something until you almost believed it. She thought about the way he had noticed she did not smile. Caleb did not come into the store the next week or the week after that. The flowers kept appearing, but she did not see him, and she began to wonder if he was avoiding her now that she knew his identity. The thought bothered her more than it should have. Then, on a Wednesday morning in late July when the heat was thick enough to chew, Caleb walked into Miller's general store with a list of supplies and a shy nod in Josephine's direction. "Morning, Miss Miller," he said politely, as though they were nothing more than shopkeeper and customer. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," she replied, taking the list from him. "I will get these items together for you." She moved through the store gathering what he needed: coffee, flour, sugar, dried beans, ammunition for his rifle, a new pair of work gloves. As she worked, she was acutely aware of him standing by the counter, his hat in his hands, waiting patiently. Other customers came and went, and Caleb stepped aside politely each time, never demanding attention or rushing her. When she finally had everything assembled, she tallied the cost and told him the total. He counted out the money carefully, mostly coins with a few worn bills, the amount exact. "Thank you for the wildflowers," Josephine said quietly as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. The store was momentarily empty of other customers, just the two of them and her father in the back room doing inventory. Caleb's expression softened. "You are welcome. Have they made you smile yet?" "Maybe once or twice," Josephine admitted, and she saw his face brighten in a way that did something strange to her chest, made it feel tight and warm at the same time. "That is good," he said. "The desert is prettier when someone appreciates it." He gathered his packages and headed for the door, but Josephine found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Mr. Stone, Caleb, what is your homestead like?" He paused, turned back. "It is rough still." "I have got a cabin built, barn for the horses, a few head of cattle I am trying to build into a proper herd. There is a creek that runs through the property during wet seasons, good grazing land. I have been clearing brush and planting grass, trying to make it into something sustainable. It is slow work for one person." "It sounds like hard work," Josephine said. "It is," Caleb agreed, "but it is mine. No one can take it from me as long as I work it and improve it. That means something out here." Josephine understood that. Ownership, independence, the ability to build something with your own hands and say this is mine. It was why her father had come west, why so many people had come west, chasing the possibility of something better. "You ever get lonely out there?" she asked, then immediately wished she had not. It was too personal, too direct, but Caleb did not seem offended. He considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said finally. "Most days, yes, but I figured lonely was better than the alternative. Easier to be alone than to lose someone you love." The words hung between them, an echo of Josephine's own fears laid bare by someone who understood them. She stared at him, this quiet cowboy who left wildflowers, and felt something shift inside her, some small crack in the wall she had built. "Yes," she whispered. "That is what I thought too." Caleb met her eyes, and in that moment there was a recognition passing between them, an acknowledgement of shared wounds and shared defenses. Then he smiled, a small, sad smile, and said, "I will see you next week, Miss Miller." "Josephine," she said impulsively. "You can call me Josephine." "Josephine," he repeated, and the way he said her name, soft and careful like it was something precious, made her breath catch. "I will see you next week, Josephine." After he left, her father emerged from the back room with an expression that was part concern, part hope. "That is the young man leaving the flowers." "Yes," Josephine said, still staring at the door Caleb had walked through. He seems like a good person." "He does," she admitted. "You could do worse than a man who notices when you are unhappy and tries to do something about it," Thomas said gently. "Papa, we have just barely spoken. And besides, he said he is fine alone. He does not want anything from me." "Maybe that is exactly why he is the right one," her father said. "Because he is not trying to take anything from you. He is just trying to give." The thought stayed with Josephine through the rest of the day, through the parade of customers and the endless small tasks that filled her hours. She had spent 2 years keeping everyone at a distance, protecting herself from the possibility of loss, and she had convinced herself it was working. But now she wondered if maybe she had been confusing protection with prison. That night she stood at her window and looked at all the wildflowers Caleb had left, their colors bright even in the lamplight. She counted them. 23 different flowers, 23 mornings he had ridden into town before dawn to leave her something beautiful. 23 small acts of kindness from someone who claimed to want nothing in return. Maybe her father was right. Maybe that was exactly what made it matter. The next morning, the wildflower was a sprig of desert lavender, purple and fragrant. Josephine picked it up, and instead of taking it directly inside, she stood on her doorstep and looked north toward where she knew Caleb's homestead must be. The sun was just rising, painting everything gold and rose, and somewhere out there he was probably already working, mending fences or tending livestock, or doing one of the 1,000 tasks that homesteading required. She wondered if he thought about her the way she had been thinking about him. The question bothered her all day, distracted her from her work enough that her father asked twice if she was feeling well. She was not ill, she was confused, which was somehow worse. She had spent 2 years being certain of exactly who she was and what she wanted, and now that certainty was eroding like sand in a windstorm. On Saturday, she made a decision. She told her father she needed to visit Mrs. Henderson to discuss the church social that was being planned for the following month. It was not entirely a lie there was a social being planned, and Mrs. Henderson was organizing it, but Josephine's true destination was 5 miles north of town. She borrowed the wagon and their old mule and set out mid-morning, following the directions Caleb had mentioned. The road was rough, barely more than a track through the scrubland, but the day was clear and hot, and the mountains stood sharp against the blue sky. She passed other homesteads along the way, small cabins and corrals scratched out of the unforgiving land, and she marveled at the determination it must take to build a life in such a place. Caleb's claim was marked by a rough wooden gate and a sign that read "Stone Ranch" in hand-carved letters. Josephine guided the mule through and followed the path to a clearing where a small cabin stood beside a barn and several corrals. The cabin was simple but well built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows, and the barn looked sturdy enough to withstand the harsh weather. Caleb had clearly been working hard to improve the place. He was in one of the corrals, working with a young horse on a lead line, and he did not notice her approach until she had stopped the wagon near the barn. When he saw her, his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been delight. "Josephine," he said, walking over with the horse following docilely behind him, "is everything all right?" "Is your father?" "Papa is fine," she said quickly. I wanted to see the place, the homestead. You talked about it and I was curious." Caleb stared at her for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. It transformed him, made him look younger and less guarded. "You wanted to see it?" "If that is all right," Josephine said, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing here? This was foolish, impulsive, completely unlike her. "Of course it is all right," Caleb said. He tied the young horse to the fence and came to help her down from the wagon. His hands were warm and calloused when they circled her waist, strong and steady, and Josephine felt something electric pass between them at the contact. Once she was on the ground, Caleb stepped back quickly, as though worried he had overstepped. "Would you like to see around?" "It is not much yet, but I am working on it." "I would like that very much," Josephine said. He showed her everything with quiet pride. The cabin with its neat interior and handmade furniture, the barn where his horses and 3 cattle were kept, the vegetable garden he had planted and was carefully nursing along with precious water from the creek. He explained his plans for expanding the herd, for planting more grass, for building a better irrigation system. As he talked, his reserve fell away and she saw his passion for this place, his vision for what it could become. "It is wonderful," Josephine said honestly, standing in the shade of the barn and looking out at the land. "You have built something real here, Caleb." "Trying to," he said. "Some days it feels impossible. The work is endless and the weather is unpredictable, and I am just one person trying to do the work of 5. But then I remember that it is mine, and that makes it worth it." "I understand that," Josephine said. "Building something that belongs to you that no one can take away. It is why Papa and I came west too." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. Then Caleb said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you really come out here today?" Josephine took a breath, steadying herself. "Because I have been thinking about what you said, about being fine alone. And I realize that I have been telling myself the same thing for 2 years, but I am not sure I believe it anymore. Or maybe I believe it, but I do not want it to be true." Caleb looked at her intently. "What changed?" "The wildflowers," Josephine admitted. "You changed it. You showed me that someone could be thoughtful and kind without wanting to take my independence away. And I wanted to see the place where you live, the thing you are building. I wanted to understand you better." "Why?" Caleb asked, and there was vulnerability in the question, a hope he was clearly trying to contain. "Because I think I might want to be your friend," Josephine said carefully. "And maybe more than that, eventually, if we both decide that being alone is not actually what we want." Caleb was very still, and Josephine watched emotions play across his face: surprise, joy, fear, uncertainty. Finally, he said, "I would like that. I would like that very much. But I need you to know something, Josephine. I am not doing well financially. This homestead takes everything I have and more. I cannot offer you an easy life or a comfortable one. Most days I am barely scraping by, and it will be years before this place is truly profitable." "I do not need easy or comfortable," Josephine said. "I need honest and kind. I need someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. Can you offer me that?" "Yes," Caleb said without hesitation. "I can offer you that. I would never want to own you, Josephine. I would want to build something together, side by side, if you were willing." The word settled something in Josephine's chest, some anxiety she had been carrying without realizing it. This was what she needed to hear, not promises of riches or comfort, but promises of respect and partnership. "Then let us start with friendship," she said. "Let us get to know each other properly without any pressure or expectations, and we will see where it leads." "I would like that," Caleb said again, and his smile was bright as sunlight. Josephine stayed for another hour, helping Caleb water the garden and listening to him talk about his plans for the ranch. He was intelligent and thoughtful, she discovered, with a dry sense of humor that surprised her into laughing more than once. When she finally climbed back into the wagon to head home, she felt lighter than she had in months, as though some burden she had not known she was carrying had been lifted. "Will you come back?" Caleb asked, holding the mule's bridle. "Yes," Josephine said, "if you would like me to." "I would like it more than almost anything," he said honestly. As she drove back toward Prescott, Josephine found herself smiling, really smiling. and she thought that maybe Caleb had succeeded in his goal after all. The wildflowers had made her happy, but it was not the flowers themselves, it was what they represented. Someone had seen her pain and her loneliness and had tried to ease it, asking nothing in return. That kind of generosity was rare enough to be worth taking a chance on. The next weeks passed in a new rhythm of growing friendship. Caleb continued to leave wildflowers each morning, but now they felt less like gifts from a stranger and more like messages from a friend. Josephine looked forward to discovering what he had found, and she started learning the names and characteristics of each desert plant. She visited his homestead again the following Saturday, and then the Saturday after that, and each visit she discovered new layers to Caleb's stone. He had come west from Texas 3 years ago after his parents died within months of each other from cholera. He had no siblings, no other family, and he had decided to start fresh in Arizona territory where land was available for those willing to work for it. He was 25 years old, only 3 years older than Josephine, but he seemed older in the way he carried himself, as though loss had aged him beyond his years. "I was engaged once," he told her one afternoon as they sat on his porch drinking coffee. "Back in Texas, before my parents died. Her name was Sarah, and we had been planning to marry that summer. But after my parents passed and I decided to come west, she did not want to leave her family. She wanted me to stay, to find work in town, to build a life close to where she grew up." "That sounds reasonable," Josephine said carefully. "It was reasonable," Caleb agreed. "But it was not what I needed. I could not stay in that town where everything reminded me of my parents, where I would have spent the rest of my life walking past the church where we buried them. I needed to go somewhere new, somewhere I could build something that was mine. Sarah did not understand that. She said if I loved her, I would stay." "And you chose to leave," Josephine said. "I chose to leave," Caleb confirmed. "And she said that proved I was capable of being alone, that I would always choose independence over love. Maybe she was right. Maybe that is why I told myself I was fine alone for so long, because it seemed easier than trying to find someone who would understand why I needed this life." Josephine reached over and took his hand, a bold gesture that felt natural in the moment. "I understand it," she said. "I understand needing to build something new after loss. I understand choosing a hard life because it is yours rather than an easy life that belongs to someone else." Caleb looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. "Yes," he said softly. "I think you do." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands on the porch while the sun moved across the sky and the desert spread out before them in shades of gold and green and red. It was intimate without being overwhelming, comfortable in a way Josephine had not expected. She had thought letting someone close would feel like losing something, but instead it felt like gaining. In town, people began to notice the growing connection between Josephine and Caleb. When he came in for supplies, he stayed longer, talking with Josephine between customers. Sometimes he brought her things from the homestead, fresh vegetables from his garden, a pretty rock he had found by the creek, once a hawk feather that made her laugh with delight. The gifts were small and practical, nothing that would cause scandal or suggest impropriety, but everyone could see the affection growing between them. "You look happy," her father said one evening as they closed up the store. "Happier than I have seen you since your mother died." Josephine did not deny it. "Caleb is a good man, Papa. He makes me want to be brave enough to care about someone again." "Your mother would be glad," Thomas said, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She always worried that you would close yourself off after she was gone. She made me promise to encourage you to live fully, not to hide from life out of fear." "I am trying," Josephine said. "It is harder than I expected. Some days I still want to pull back to protect myself. But then I see Caleb and I remember that being alone felt safe, but it also felt empty. I think maybe empty is not worth the safety. I think you are right, her father said. By late August, Josephine and Caleb had settled into a courtship that suited them both. It was slow and careful, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passion and impulse. They were both too scarred by loss to rush into anything, but they were also both beginning to believe that maybe they did not have to be alone forever. One Sunday, Caleb invited Josephine to ride out to a canyon he knew where the wildflowers grew particularly thick. She borrowed her father's horse and met him at dawn, and they rode together through the cool morning air as the sun painted the world in shades of pink and gold. The canyon was beautiful, a hidden place where water collected and plants thrived, and Josephine gasped when she saw the profusion of blooms covering the ground like a carpet. "This is where I have been getting most of the flowers," Caleb said, dismounting and helping her down. "I discovered it my first summer here, and I have been coming back ever since. It feels like a secret place, somewhere the desert keeps hidden from everyone who does not take the time to look." They walked through the flowers together, naming the ones they knew and making up silly names for the ones they did not. Caleb told her about the different seasons, how the blooms changed throughout the year, which ones were first after rain and which ones lasted longest in drought. His knowledge was deep and genuine, born from 3 years of paying attention to this land. "You love it here," Josephine observed. "Not just your homestead, but the whole territory, the desert itself." "I do," Caleb admitted. "I know most people see it as harsh and ugly, all dust and thorns. But there is beauty here if you know how to look for it. There is resilience. Things grow here that could not survive anywhere else because they have learned to adapt, to find water where there seems to be none, to bloom in the brief moments when conditions are right. I admire that. I want to be like that." Josephine looked at him, this man who had been brave enough to start over after loss, who had built a life from nothing in an unforgiving place, and she felt her heart open in a way she had thought impossible. She was falling in love with him, she realized. It had happened slowly, over weeks of conversations and shared silences, over wildflowers and honesty and the recognition of kindred spirits. She was falling in love, and it terrified her and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Caleb," she said, and he turned to face her, his expression open and questioning. "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice, the fear that she was about to pull away. "I am scared," Josephine said honestly. "I am scared of caring about you because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love. I watched my father almost die from grief after my mother passed, and I swore I would never make myself that vulnerable. But I think I am falling in love with you anyway, and I do not know how to do this without being terrified." Caleb closed the distance between them and took both her hands in his. "I am scared too," he said. "I have been scared since the first morning I left a flower on your doorstep, because even then I knew you were someone who could matter to me. I told myself I was fine alone because alone felt safer, but the truth is I was just lonely and calling it independence. You make me want to be brave enough to try again, to risk caring about someone even though I know it might hurt." "So what do we do?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We decide that it is worth it," Caleb said simply. "We decide that even if life is uncertain and people die and hearts break, the time we have together is worth the risk. Because the alternative is spending the rest of our lives safe and alone and wondering what we missed." Josephine looked into his brown eyes, so warm and sincere, and she made her choice. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as he responded. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and she felt the solid warmth of him, the reality of another person who wanted her and valued her, and was willing to be vulnerable with her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I did not plan to, but I do. I love your strength and your intelligence and the way you keep all those wildflowers on your windowsill even though you pretended they annoyed you. I love that you understand why I need this life, and you do not ask me to be anyone other than who I am." "I love you too," Josephine said, and the words felt like freedom rather than chains. "I love your kindness and your patience and the way you see beauty where other people only see harshness. I love that you never tried to convince me to need you, but somehow you made me want to anyway." They stood together in the canyon of Wildflowers, holding each other while the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm. It was a beginning, tentative and hopeful, and for the first time in 2 years Josephine allowed herself to believe that maybe happiness was possible after all. The courtship that followed was the talk of Prescott. Everyone had opinions about the match. Some thought Josephine was foolish to tie herself to a struggling homesteader. Others thought Caleb was lucky to have caught the attention of the smartest woman in town. But Josephine and Caleb paid little attention to the gossip. They were too busy learning to build a relationship on the foundation of friendship they had created. Caleb came into town twice a week now instead of once, timing his visits so he could spend time with Josephine between her work at the store. They took walks in the evening when the heat had faded, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his plans for the ranch, his dreams of building a real herd and maybe someday having horses to sell. She told him about her mother, stories she had not shared with anyone since the death, memories that hurt less when spoken aloud to someone who understood grief. In September, Caleb asked Thomas Miller for permission to marry Josephine. He did it formally, sitting in their small parlor above the store with his hat in his hands and his voice steady despite his obvious nerves. "I know I cannot offer her much right now," Caleb said. "The homestead is still raw and the work is endless, and there will be years of struggle before it becomes profitable. But I love your daughter, Mr. Miller, and I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her. I will never take her independence or her intelligence for granted, and I will work myself to the bone to build a life we can both be proud of." Thomas looked at the young man before him, seeing the sincerity and determination in his face. Then he looked at Josephine, who was standing in the doorway with her heart in her eyes, and he smiled. "You have my blessing," Thomas said, "not because of what you can offer materially, but because you have already given my daughter back something I thought she had lost. You have helped her learn to be happy again, to trust again. That is worth more than any amount of money or comfort." Josephine crossed the room and hugged her father tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. "Be happy," he whispered back. "That is all your mother and I ever wanted for you." They planned a simple wedding for October, when the worst of the summer heat would have passed, but before the winter cold set in. Josephine made her own dress, cream-colored calico with lace at the collar and cuffs, practical enough to wear again but pretty enough to feel special. Caleb bought a new shirt and had his one good suit cleaned and mended. They invited the whole town because that was what you did in a small community, and Mrs. Henderson organized a celebration in the church social hall with food contributed by dozens of families. The night before the wedding, Josephine stood at her window looking at the collection of wildflowers that still sat on the sill. There were dozens now, dried and fading but still beautiful in their way. Tomorrow she would become Caleb's wife, would leave this room above the store and move out to the homestead to begin a new life. It was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. Her father came to stand beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," Josephine said, and she meant it. "I am scared, but I am not uncertain. Caleb is a good man and I love him. I know there will be hard times, but I also know we will face them together. That makes all the difference." "Your mother would be so proud of you," Thomas said. "You have grown into such a strong, brave woman. I am going to miss you terribly, but I am so glad you found someone worthy of you." "I will only be 5 miles away," Josephine said, squeezing his hand, "and you can visit whenever you want. We will need all the help we can get building that homestead into something lasting." The wedding ceremony was simple and beautiful, held in the small church at the center of town, with the territorial governor's representative serving as officiant. Josephine walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and when she saw Caleb waiting for her at the front, his face full of love and hope, she knew she was making the right choice. They said their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other, to be partners in all things, to build a life together regardless of what hardships might come. When Caleb kissed her as his wife, the whole church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed was joyful and chaotic, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. People toasted the couple and offered advice and told embarrassing stories. Caleb never let go of Josephine's hand the entire time, as though he needed the physical connection to believe this was real. As evening came and they prepared to leave for the homestead, Mrs. Henderson pressed a bundle into Josephine's hands. "Seeds," she explained, "for your garden. Every home needs flowers as well as vegetables." Josephine hugged the older woman, grateful for the kindness. Then she and Caleb climbed into his wagon, now loaded with her belongings and wedding gifts, and began the journey to their new home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and Josephine leaned against her husband's shoulder as they rode, feeling something she had not felt in years, complete and utter contentment. The homestead looked different to her now that it was her home too. Caleb carried her over the threshold of the cabin in the traditional way, both of them laughing as he nearly knocked her head on the doorframe. Inside, he had cleaned and prepared everything, adding small touches she noticed immediately. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, an extra chair he had made, a quilt his mother had sewn draped across the bed. "Welcome home," Caleb said softly, setting her down gently. "Home," Josephine repeated, and the word felt right in a way nothing had since her mother died. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect, two people learning each other with patience and care. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Caleb traced patterns on her shoulder with his fingertips. "I cannot believe you are really here," he murmured. "I keep thinking I will wake up and you will have been a dream." "I am really here," Josephine assured him. "And I am not going anywhere." "Good," Caleb said, pulling her closer, "because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," Josephine said. "You gave me wildflowers every morning for months just to make me smile. How could I regret choosing someone who sees me that clearly?" Life on the homestead was harder than Josephine had anticipated, but also more rewarding. She woke before dawn each day to help Caleb with the endless chores, feeding the animals, milking the cow Caleb had recently acquired, tending the garden, hauling water from the creek. Her hands, which had been soft from store work, quickly developed calluses and blisters that hardened into permanent roughness. Her face tanned despite her bonnet, her body grew lean and strong from constant physical labor, but she was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. Working beside Caleb felt natural, a partnership where each person contributed according to their strengths. He taught her to handle the livestock, to read the weather signs, to identify the best grazing areas. She taught him better organization systems, how to keep proper accounts, how to plan ahead for supplies needed months in advance. Together they were more effective than either had been alone. In November, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly. A missed cycle followed by morning nausea followed by the undeniable truth of a body changing. She was terrified to tell Caleb, afraid of how a baby would complicate their already difficult life. But when she finally gathered the courage to share the news, his reaction was pure joy. "A baby," he breathed, his hand trembling as he placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Caleb said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You have given me everything, Josephine. A home, a partner, and now a family. I never thought I would have any of those things again." "We are going to be all right," Josephine said, as much to convince herself as him. "We will figure it out together." And they did. Through the winter months when the work slowed and they spent more time inside, they prepared for the baby. Caleb built a cradle from wood he had been saving, carving careful designs into the headboard. Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, using scraps of fabric her father brought from the store. They talked for hours about names and hopes and fears, slowly transforming from a couple into a family. Josephine's father visited regularly, bringing supplies and news from town and his own excitement about becoming a grandfather. He had been worried about Josephine living so far from medical help, especially with a baby coming, but he could see how happy she was, and that eased his concerns. "You are blooming out here," he told her one afternoon in January as they sat by the fire. "I have never seen you so content." "I never knew I could be this happy," Josephine admitted. "I thought I had to choose between independence and love, but Caleb showed me that the right person does not make you choose. He makes you more yourself, not less." "That is what your mother and I had," Thomas said softly. "That is why losing her hurt so much, because she had become part of who I was. But I would not trade the years we had together for anything. The love was worth the loss." His words stayed with Josephine through the remainder of her pregnancy. Yes, loving someone made you vulnerable to loss. But the alternative, a life lived safely alone, was not really living at all. She thought about how empty she had been before Caleb, how she had convinced herself that numbness was the same as strength. Now she knew better. Real strength was loving despite the risks, building despite the uncertainty, hoping despite the possibility of heartbreak. Their son was born on a warm day in early June 1877, with her father and Mrs. Henderson attending the birth since there was no doctor available. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Josephine was certain she would not survive. But Caleb stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, and when she finally heard the baby's first cry, she felt a surge of triumph and relief so intense she wept. "A boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, placing the tiny, squirming infant on Josephine's chest. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Josephine looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists and the shock of dark hair, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. This was her child, hers and Caleb's, a person they had created together out of love and hope. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Caleb was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son. "He is perfect," he said. "You are perfect. Thank you, Josephine. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas, after Josephine's father, with the middle name of Samuel after Caleb's father. Thomas Samuel Stone, born into a hard life but surrounded by love from his first breath. The baby was colicky and demanding, keeping them awake most nights, but neither Josephine nor Caleb minded. They were too in awe of the tiny life they were now responsible for, too grateful for the family they had created. As the months passed, and Thomas grew from a newborn into an infant with a personality, the homestead continued to develop. Caleb had a good year with the cattle, and he was able to buy 3 more head and a breeding bull. The garden produced abundantly, and Josephine spent weeks preserving vegetables for the winter. They built an addition onto the cabin, a second room that could serve as a nursery and eventually as space for more children if they were blessed with them. Life was not easy. There were droughts and sickness, times when money was impossibly tight, nights when they fell into bed too exhausted to speak. But there was also joy. Thomas's first smile, the first time the calf Caleb had raised from birth successfully bred, the evening they sat on their porch watching lightning dance across distant mountains and felt utterly at peace. On their first wedding anniversary, Caleb gave Josephine a gift, a leather-bound book with blank pages. "For recording things," he explained. "Stories about Thomas, memories about the homestead, anything you want to preserve. I thought maybe someday our children would want to know how we built this life, how we found each other." Josephine opened the book and saw that Caleb had already written the first entry in his careful script. October 15, 1876. I married Josephine Miller and became the luckiest man in Arizona Territory. She laughed and cried at the same time, pulling him into a kiss. "I love you," she said. "I love our life and our son, and even the incredibly hard work and the uncertainty. I love all of it because it is ours." "I love you too," Caleb said. "Every single day I wake up grateful that you gave me a chance, that you were brave enough to risk loving someone again." That night, after Thomas was asleep and they had finished the evening chores, Josephine sat down with the book and wrote her own entry. "I used to think being alone was the same as being strong. Then a cowboy started leaving wildflowers on my doorstep, and he taught me that real strength is allowing yourself to be vulnerable with the right person. This is the story of how I learned to stop being afraid and started being happy." The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. In 1878, Josephine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline after Caleb's mother. She was an easier baby than Thomas had been, content and smiley, and Caleb was completely smitten with his little girl from the moment she was born. The homestead continued to grow. By 1880, they had a proper herd of 20 cattle and had started raising horses as well. Caleb's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled horseman spread, and people started coming from as far as Phoenix to buy his animals. The income was still modest, but it was steady, and they were able to slowly improve their property and their quality of life. Thomas Miller sold the general store in 1881 and moved out to the homestead to live with them. He was getting older, and the work of running the store alone had become too much. Josephine was grateful to have him close, and he was invaluable help with the children and the endless work of maintaining the property. He built himself a small cabin a short distance from the main house, close enough to be family but far enough to maintain independence. In 1883, their third child was born, another boy they named William. He came into the world screaming and continued to be the loudest of their children, demanding attention and affection in equal measure. Caleb joked that William had gotten his mother's determination and his father's stubbornness, a combination that would either make him incredibly successful or incredibly troublesome. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. The children grew healthy and strong, running wild across the homestead, learning to ride almost before they could walk. Thomas started a small school in his cabin, teaching not just his grandchildren but also the children from neighboring homesteads. Josephine managed the accounts and the garden and the endless domestic work that keeping a family required. Caleb worked the land and the animals, building the ranch into something that could support them all, but they always made time for each other. Every morning, no matter how busy the day ahead, Caleb still brought Josephine a wildflower. Sometimes it was picked fresh from the desert, sometimes it was from the garden they had planted together, but it was always there, a reminder of how they had begun. "You know you do not have to keep doing this," Josephine told him one morning in 1885, as he handed her a sprig of desert marigold, the same flower he had left on her doorstep 9 years earlier. "I am already yours. You do not need to court me anymore." "I am not courting you," Caleb said, pulling her into his arms despite the fact that all 3 children were watching and giggling. "I am reminding you every single day that I see you, I appreciate you, and I am grateful for you. That does not stop being important just because we are married." Josephine kissed him, not caring that Thomas was making exaggerated gagging noises and Caroline was laughing. "I am grateful for you too," she said, "every single day." As the children grew older, they took on more responsibilities around the ranch. Thomas, now 8 years old, helped his father with the cattle and showed a natural aptitude for animal handling. Caroline, 6, had her mother's sharp mind and loved helping her grandfather with the teaching. William, just 2, was still too young for real work, but he followed everyone around with endless energy and questions. In 1886, Arizona Territory experienced one of the worst droughts in memory. The creek that ran through their property dried up completely by July, and they had to haul water from a spring 3 miles away. The grass withered, the cattle grew thin, and every day was a struggle to keep everything alive. Josephine watched her husband grow gaunt with worry and exhaustion, working himself nearly to death to save what they had built. One night in August, after an entire day spent hauling water and moving cattle to a distant grazing area where a little grass remained, Caleb collapsed at the dinner table, simply too tired to eat. Josephine sent the children to their grandfather's cabin and then sat beside her husband, taking his calloused hand in hers. "We are going to get through this," she said firmly. "We have survived hard times before, and we will survive this too. What if we cannot?" Caleb asked, and she heard the despair in his voice. "What if I lose everything? What if I cannot provide for you and the children?" "Then we will figure something else out," Josephine said. "We will adapt, just like the wildflowers do when the rain does not come. We will find a way to survive until conditions improve. But Caleb, you are not doing this alone. We are partners, remember. Your burden is my burden, and we will carry it together." Caleb looked at her, and she saw the moment when her words reached him, when he remembered that he was not the only one holding their family together. "I love you," he said. "I do not know what I would do without you." "Good thing you will never have to find out," Josephine said, and she held him while he finally let himself cry from exhaustion and fear and the terrible weight of responsibility. The drought finally broke in September with a series of thunderstorms that brought blessed rain. They lost 4 head of cattle that year, a significant blow, but they survived. The experience taught them lessons about water management and drought preparation that they would use in the years to come. They dug a proper well, installed cisterns for catching rainwater, and diversified their income streams so they were not entirely dependent on the cattle. By 1890, the ranch was truly thriving. They had over 50 head of cattle, a breeding program for quarter horses that was gaining recognition across the territory. and enough income to make actual improvements to their quality of life. They added 2 more rooms to the main house, built a proper barn with a hayloft, and even bought a piano for Caroline, who showed musical talent. Thomas was 14 now, tall and serious, already planning his future on the ranch. Caroline was 12, beautiful and intelligent, torn between wanting to be a teacher like her grandfather and wanting to stay on the ranch. William was 8, wild and charming, constantly getting into trouble but impossible to stay mad at. Josephine was 36 years old, her hair starting to show threads of gray, her body marked by years of hard work and 3 pregnancies. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone happy, someone who had built a good life through courage and love and sheer determination. She thought about the woman she had been at 22, so certain that safety meant being alone, and she barely recognized her. One evening in October, as they celebrated another wedding anniversary, Caleb took her back to the canyon where he had first told her he loved her. The children were spending the night at their grandfather's cabin, giving their parents a rare evening alone. They rode in comfortable silence, bodies moving in rhythm with the horses, and when they reached the canyon, the wildflowers were blooming in profusion after a wet summer. 14 years, Caleb said as they dismounted. 14 years since I was terrified to ask your father for permission to marry you. 14 years since I was terrified to say yes, Josephine said. Best decision I ever made. They walked through the flowers hand in hand, and Caleb told her what he had been planning. Thomas wants to take over the cattle operation eventually. I think he is ready to start learning the business side of things, not just the daily work. And I was thinking maybe we could start focusing more on the horses. That is where my real passion is anyway. I think that sounds wonderful, Josephine said. And it would give Thomas the responsibility he has been wanting. He is growing up so fast. They all are, Caleb said. Soon enough Caroline will be old enough to court, and I will have to spend all my time chasing away unsuitable young men. Josephine laughed. She is only 12. We have a few years yet. Not enough years, Caleb said, but he was smiling. They sat down in a patch of flowers, the same spot where they had kissed for the first time 14 years earlier, and Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For the wildflowers. For seeing me when I was trying so hard to be invisible. For being patient enough to let me learn to trust again. For building this life with me. Caleb kissed the top of her head. You do not need to thank me for loving you, Josephine. It is the easiest thing I have ever done. They stayed in the canyon until the stars came out, talking about their children and their plans, and all the years they still had ahead of them. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the windows of the house were glowing with lamplight, a beacon guiding them home. The years continued to pass, bringing the changes that time always brings. Thomas grew into a capable young man and took over more of the ranch operations. At 20, he married a neighboring rancher's daughter, a practical woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far side of the property and started their own family, giving Josephine and Caleb their first grandchildren. Caroline did become a teacher, running the school her grandfather had started and expanding it to serve more families. She married at 23 to a lawyer from Prescott, a good man who respected her intelligence and supported her career. They lived in town but visited the ranch often, and Caroline always said she was raising her children to love the desert the way her father had taught her to. William was the one who surprised everyone. At 16, he announced he wanted to be a veterinarian and apprenticed himself to the territorial vet. He studied hard, eventually going to California for formal training, and returned to open a practice in Prescott that served ranchers throughout the region. He never married, claiming he was too busy, but he was a devoted uncle to his nieces and nephews and a frequent visitor to the ranch. Thomas Miller lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1895. His death was hard on all of them, but especially on Josephine, who had never forgotten how her father had encouraged her to be brave enough to love again. They buried him on the ranch, in a spot overlooking the valley, and planted wildflowers on his grave. By 1900, Josephine and Caleb were in their mid-40s, still healthy and active, but feeling the weight of years of hard work. They had turned over most of the daily ranch operations to Thomas Jr. and his wife, and they found themselves with time they had not had in decades. Time to sit on the porch in the evening and watch the sunset. Time to take long rides into the desert just for the pleasure of it. Time to simply be together. You ever regret it? Josephine asked one evening as they sat watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Taking a chance on someone who told you she was fine alone. Never, Caleb said without hesitation. You were fine alone, but we are better together. That has been true from the first morning I left a wildflower on your doorstep. I was so determined to not need anyone, Josephine said. I thought independence meant isolation. You taught me it could mean partnership instead. We taught each other, Caleb corrected. You taught me that loving someone did not mean losing myself, that I could build a life with someone and still be who I needed to be. They watched their grandchildren chase each other through the yard, their laughter bright and clear in the evening air. 3 generations now living on the land Caleb had claimed with nothing but determination and hope. A legacy built on love and hard work and the willingness to be vulnerable. Tell me again about the day you decided to start leaving the flowers, Josephine said. A request she made often because she never tired of the story. Caleb smiled, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. I was at the saloon picking up supplies, and I heard you tell that drunk cowboy you did not need anyone. And the way you said it, with such conviction, I knew you meant it. But I also heard the sadness underneath, the fear. And I recognized it because I felt the same way. So I went home and I thought about it all night. And I realized that just because we are capable of being alone does not mean we should be. The desert is full of beautiful things that bloom briefly and fade, but they bloom anyway, because that is what living things do. They reach for the sun even when the conditions are harsh. They make beauty even when no one is watching. And I wanted to do that for you. I wanted to give you beauty without asking for anything in return, just to remind you that the world still had softness in it. Josephine reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. You changed my life, she said. You showed me that I did not have to choose between strength and love, that I could have both. You changed mine too, Caleb said. You made me believe I could have a family again, that I could build something lasting. Everything good in my life came from taking a chance on leaving you those wildflowers. As the sun set and the grandchildren were called in for supper, Josephine and Caleb sat in the gathering darkness, still holding hands. Tomorrow morning, she knew, there would be a wildflower on the windowsill. There had been one every single morning for 24 years, and she did not expect that would ever change. It was their tradition, their private language of love and commitment. In 1902, Arizona Territory was still growing, still becoming what it would eventually be. Statehood was still a decade away, and the old Wild West of outlaws and gunfighters was fading into memory, replaced by ranches and towns and the civilized rhythms of established life. Josephine was 48 years old now, her hair more gray than auburn, her hands permanently roughened from work. But she was happy in a deep, settled way that came from a life well lived. Caleb was 51, his dark hair silver at the temples, his body still strong but slower than it had been. He still rose before dawn every day, still worked alongside his son to keep the ranch running. And every morning without fail, he brought Josephine a wildflower. "You know I love you even without the flowers," Josephine teased him one morning in April as he handed her a cluster of purple lupine. "I know," Caleb said, "but I made a promise to myself 26 years ago that I would give you beauty every single day of your life. And I intend to keep that promise until the day I die." "You are impossibly romantic for a cowboy," Josephine said, but she was smiling as she added the lupine to the vase on the kitchen table. "Only for you," Caleb said, pulling her in for a kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. They had a good life, better than either of them had imagined possible during those early days when they were both so afraid of being hurt again. They had raised 3 good children who had become capable, kind adults. They had built a ranch that would support multiple generations. They had weathered droughts and hard times and the endless challenges that came with living in an unforgiving landscape. And they had done it all together, partners in every sense of the word. As the years continued to pass, Josephine and Caleb settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage. They knew each other's thoughts almost before they were spoken, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, moved around each other with the practiced ease of 2 people who had shared space for decades. Their love had changed from the passionate intensity of early romance to something deeper and more enduring, a companionship built on mutual respect and understanding, and the shared history of a life built together. By 1910, they were both in their mid-50s, and the ranch had expanded far beyond what Caleb had once dreamed possible. Thomas Jr. had proved to be an excellent manager, and the Stone Ranch was now one of the most successful operations in the region. They had over 200 head of cattle, a thriving horse breeding program, and enough income to live comfortably. The cabin where Josephine and Caleb had started their married life was now used as a guest house, replaced by a larger home with modern conveniences like indoor plumbing and a proper kitchen. But some things never changed. Every morning, Caleb still brought Josephine a wildflower. Even when his arthritis made it hard to mount his horse, even when his back ached from decades of hard work, he still made sure she woke to find something beautiful waiting for her. "You are going to wear yourself out," Josephine scolded gently one morning when she saw him wincing as he moved. "It is worth it," Caleb said simply. "Some traditions are worth maintaining no matter what." Their children worried about them as they aged, wanted them to slow down and let others do the work. But Josephine and Caleb were not ready to become idle. They still had too much living to do, too many sunrises to watch together, too many grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren to spoil and teach and love. In 1912, Arizona finally became a state, and the celebration in Prescott was enormous. Josephine and Caleb attended with their children and grandchildren, watching the ceremony with tears in their eyes. They had been part of the territory's growth, had helped build it into something worthy of statehood. It felt like a culmination of all the years of hard work and hope. "We did it," Caleb said as they watched the fireworks that night, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "We built something lasting." "We did," Josephine agreed. "And it is better than anything I imagined when I was that angry young woman insisting she did not need anyone." "You did not need anyone," Caleb said, "but you chose me anyway. That is what made it matter." As they grew older, their love only deepened. They spent more time together, taking long, slow walks around the ranch, sitting on the porch in the evening talking about everything and nothing. They told stories to their grandchildren about the early days of the territory, about how they had met and fallen in love, about the wildflowers that had changed both their lives. In 1920, on their 44th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All three of their children were there with their families, and the house was full of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ranging from infants to teenagers. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful, and Josephine looked around at the family she and Caleb had created and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had eaten and the children had been put to bed, Caleb took Josephine's hand and led her outside. The fall air was cool and comfortable, the sky brilliantly clear. He walked her to the corral where his old paint mare had once stood, though the horse had died years ago and been replaced by others. "You remember?" he asked. "When you came out here that first morning and asked me why I was leaving flowers." "I remember," Josephine said. "I was so determined to make you stop." "I am glad you did not," Caleb said. "I am glad you gave me a chance. These 44 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life." "Mine too," Josephine said. "You taught me that being loved did not mean being weak, that I could be strong and independent and still have a partner who respected and valued me. You never tried to change me or diminish me. You just loved me exactly as I was." Caleb pulled her close, and they swayed together under the stars, dancing to music only they could hear. They were both old now, their bodies marked by time and work, but in that moment they felt young again, felt like the tentative couple who had once stood in a canyon of wildflowers and decided to be brave enough to try. "I would do it all again," Caleb whispered. "Every hard day, every struggle, every moment of fear and uncertainty. I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Josephine said. "So would I." They lived another decade together, growing old with grace and dignity. Caleb's health began to fail first, his heart weakening after 7 decades of hard living. But he remained determined to give Josephine her daily wildflower, even when he could barely walk. On the mornings when he was too weak to leave the house, he would have one of the grandchildren pick a flower and bring it to him so he could place it on Josephine's nightstand before she woke. "You do not have to keep doing this," Josephine told him one morning in 1928 when she found him struggling to his feet, a flower clutched in his trembling hand. "I know you love me, Caleb. You do not need to prove it every single day." "Yes, I do," Caleb said stubbornly. "I promised myself I would give you beauty every day of your life, and I will not break that promise now." Josephine helped him back to bed, tears streaming down her face. She placed the flower, a simple dandelion from the yard, in the vase on the nightstand, and then climbed into bed beside him, holding his hand as she had held it for over 50 years. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much it still takes my breath away sometimes. Thank you for every wildflower, every kindness, every single day you chose to love me." "Easiest choice I ever made," Caleb said, and even though his voice was weak, his conviction was as strong as it had been that first morning when he left a wildflower on her doorstep. Caleb Stone died peacefully in his sleep on a warm June morning in 1929, at the age of 78. He was surrounded by his family, his hand held in Josephine's, his life complete and well lived. They buried him on the ranch beside Josephine's father, in the land he had claimed and built into something lasting. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned over a lifetime of integrity and hard work. Josephine stood at the grave and placed a single wildflower on his casket before they lowered it into the ground. A cluster of desert marigolds, the same flower he had left on her doorstep that morning all those years ago when she had finally caught him in the act. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for loving me, for teaching me that being alone might be safe but being together was better. I will love you until the day I die, and I will see you again on the other side." After Caleb died, Josephine continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was 75 years old, still sharp-minded and capable, and she threw herself into being the matriarch of the large family she had helped create. She told stories about Caleb, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had never known him. She talked about the wildflowers and the courtship and the hard early years when they had built everything from nothing. Every morning when she woke, Josephine looked at her nightstand expecting to see it empty for the first time in over 50 years. But every morning, there was a wildflower there. The first few days she thought perhaps she was confused, misremembering. But when she asked, her family explained. Caleb had made arrangements before he died. He had spoken to each of his children and grandchildren, extracting promises that they would continue the tradition. For as long as Josephine lived, there would be a wildflower on her nightstand every single morning, a gift of love reaching out from beyond the grave. Josephine cried when she learned this, overwhelmed by the depth of Caleb's love and forethought. Even in death, he was keeping his promise to give her beauty every single day of her life. She lived another 6 years, healthy and active almost until the very end. She spent her days with her family, working in the garden she had planted decades ago, teaching her great-grandchildren about the desert plants and their uses. She sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, remembering all the sunsets she had watched with Caleb beside her. In the spring of 1935, at the age of 81, Josephine Miller Stone died peacefully in her sleep. She had lived a long, full life, rich with love and family and purpose. They buried her beside Caleb, reunited at last with the man who had changed her life by leaving wildflowers on her doorstep. The Stone Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through Thomas J.R.'s line, and continuing to be one of the most successful operations in Arizona. The family maintained many of Caleb and Josephine's traditions, including the daily wildflower ritual. Even now, over a century after Caleb first placed that brittlebush bloom on Josephine's doorstep, the Stone family continues to give wildflowers to the people they love, a reminder that beauty and thoughtfulness matter even in a harsh world. The story of Caleb and Josephine became part of family lore, told and retold to each new generation. The story of how a stubborn young woman insisted she was fine alone, and how a quiet cowboy showed her that being loved did not make you weak, it made you stronger. The story of how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is allow yourself to be vulnerable with the right person. The story of how a simple gesture repeated daily for over 50 years can become the foundation of a love that lasts forever. Their graves still sit on a hillside overlooking the ranch they built together, marked by simple stones and surrounded by wildflowers that bloom every spring. Desert marigolds and lupine, penstemon and Indian paintbrush, globe mallow and scarlet gilia, all the flowers Caleb once picked to bring his beloved. And if you visit in the early morning when the light is just right, you can almost see them. A young cowboy and the woman who learned to love again, standing together in the wildflowers, choosing each other over and over until the very end. Because that is what real love is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to be brave despite it. Not the promise of an easy life, but the commitment to face the hard times together. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but small acts of kindness repeated daily until they become the language of your heart. Caleb told Josephine he was fine alone, and maybe he was. But he chose to not be alone, and that choice made all the difference. He left her a wildflower every morning for over 50 years, and in doing so, he gave her something far more valuable than flowers. He gave her the courage to hope again, to trust again, to love again. And together, they built a life more beautiful than either could have created alone. A legacy that continues to bloom generations later like the desert wildflowers that survive and thrive despite the harsh conditions. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are actually the prisons that keep us from living fully. That being fine alone is not the same as being truly happy. That the right person will not take your independence or diminish your strength, they will enhance it, complement it, celebrate it. And that love, real lasting love, is built not in grand romantic moments but in the daily choice to show up, to care, to give beauty without demanding anything in return. The wildflowers still bloom in the Arizona desert every spring, brief and brilliant against the harsh landscape. And somewhere in the hills north of Prescott, on a ranch built by two people brave enough to love despite their fears, those flowers continue to grow wild and free, a living testament to the power of small kindnesses and the enduring nature of true love.